Well, it is great to be in the house with you again. And if you've been coming over the last couple months, you've noticed that every week there's something different. We're getting closer and closer to the renos being complete at Discovery Church. Maybe by next year, this time, it'll be done. But if you're here for the very first time today, thanks for taking some time to be here in this space. We're so glad that you took time to be here. We believe this. We believe that this time together, this hour and 10 minutes, will be the best hour of your week that will springboard you in to the next 167 hours. And today, even more so, because we have a special guest with us today, and he has spoken here before. He's actually a childhood friend of mine. Hopefully he doesn't tell me too many stories about us as childhood friends and running around at youth camp. But if he does, that's okay, because that's truth, and I'm okay with it. So I give you complete permission to embarrass me however much you want. But we are so excited and so honored to have Pastor Matt Joy with us today, an old friend, but also a friend of our house. He's spoken here before, but this is the first time. This is actually the first time I think I've ever heard you speak.
Wow.
Maybe. So I'm excited to be able to hear what the Lord has placed on your hands. So why don't you put your hands together for Pastor Matt Joy this morning?
And if it wasn't the first time, it wasn't that memorable. So I won't think too long and hard about you being in the audience at any time. So good to be back with Discovery, and as Lauren mentioned, so good to be in the room with Lauren and Shauna Lee today. I honor you guys. I honor what's happening here at Discovery, even from when I was here a few short weeks ago, a couple months ago to now. The change physically to this space is just incredible, and I think as you'll hear from my heart and what I feel is God's heart over this house today is that it is not just about the physical space. Obviously, I want to share a message today talking about making room. And it aligns directly with one of your core values, that community is your strength. So let's jump in today. Imagine with me stepping into a crowded room prepared for a meal that you're invited to, but no assigned seating. Right? You know you're supposed to be in the room, but there's no assigned seating. Picture that room filling up, very few chairs left, hustle, bustle, lots of activity. You have your plate of food and this anxiety of where am I going to sit? Maybe it's a crowded cafeteria. Just imagine that moment and feeling anxious maybe a little bit already, like who am I going to sit with? What conversation? Who am I going to have to talk to? And you're just looking around the room, scouring for that one safe space to find yourself and to kind of sneak away into. Your mind is likely drifted from what is on the menu to where are you going to sit. You start picturing worst case scenarios of scouring table to table, seeing no familiar faces and very few empty seats. It's an anxiety-driven experience, and had some encounter with it or have been in a room like that or a situation like it. Your sense of safety and security just dissipates, and you're now contemplating a course of action that may maybe even involve leaving said room in defense of a potentially embarrassing moment, right? Maybe it's just me, but just humor me for a moment. But when your thoughts and stress are drowned out by this voice calling you by name, hey, Matt, and then you give them your attention, and there's this invitational gesture to come and an empty chair, just this flood of like, oh, making room. That's the heart of what I want to say. So tap into that feeling for a second today. Sometimes it can even come without conversation in a different context altogether. Let me bring you back to Southwest Edmonton, where I reside, and tell you a little quick story of two neighbors there. Joined by warm greetings exchanged on the regular, almost daily, their driveways separated by the street that they call home. That's their table. A wide smile and a wave is the meat of their conversation. It hasn't gone much deeper than that, but it is oh so meaningful. Periodically, it's a wave from a car driving by or a bicycle zooming up the street. One is a devout Christian, one is a devout Sikh, one is a father of young kids, one is a grandfather and whose kids have grown and left the nest. They feel like friends, but they don't know each other's names. One speaks Punjabi, one English, and yet it's one of the most stark reminders in my life currently of the power of human connection, the power of kindness that can translate all of those things that would normally separate us, that would say, this is someone who is other than you, and seeing life from a different perspective, and yet this connection is so real. It's the substance of meaningful living and healthy relationships. Dr. Vivek Murthy is a Surgeon General for the United States Armed Forces, and he wrote this book during the pandemic called Together, The Healing Power of Human Connection in a Sometimes Lonely World. And Dr. Murthy shares 4 strategies that will help us in that context weather the crisis, right? Not too long ago, we were in the midst of all these restrictions and social isolation and dealing with that. But not just that, but he says healing into the future and bringing a world that's more connected than ever. And we all know we need that. And he says these 4 things. Number 1, spend time with those you love. That might seem like the easiest bit of advice you've received, but intentionally, minimum 15 minutes a day, finding those in your circle, your people, and getting in their presence and being present with them. Secondly, when you're in their presence, focus on the other. Avoid multitasking and distraction. Give people your full-on attention, he says. Thirdly, embrace solitude. So in the midst of needing human connection, it's also very important for you to understand what's going on inside of you and to be in touch with what you're feeling and to withdraw, for prayer, meditation, and that sense of solitude. And then also knowing that there will be times in the midst of our human relationships where we will help, but also need help. And the sense of choosing to be vulnerable and receiving. So he gives us these 4 strategies that are really powerful. You see, we crave this authentic community. We crave the sense of feeling like we are seen, that we are loved, that we are known, and yet know full on that, especially in the midst of today's world where we are kind of pushed and encouraged into our individual silos and spaces, that it won't just happen naturally. There is a loneliness epidemic, and it's been amplified certainly over the last couple of years. For me, when I think through this sense and this anxiety of wanting to belong, I think of junior high. I had just moved into a new town going into grade 7. Everybody was switching schools, and I came from a community of 300 into a city of 30,000. Amazing. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, welcome to the Rock. So, but I remember that sense of wanting to belong going into grade 7. And then right through my teenage years, it took on different iterations when we had to move our family again. Last fall, it took the feelings of leaving a career and starting a new one and going into an office and hoping that you were going to be received and that people would welcome you and that you'd have this sense of belonging. And I thank God that was the case. But I remember those feelings, that anxiety. Maybe for you it's office and work related as well. Maybe you can draw back to a point in your childhood or your teen years or your young adult years where loneliness gripped your heart and you longed for connection that you couldn't seem to find. Maybe this very morning, it's this very room where you step out and maybe on invitation from somebody or just because you're searching yourself, you find yourself in a space like this feeling like, am I going to be received? Is anybody going to talk to me? Where will I sit? All those questions. And if you're not thinking that, think about that when you're inviting people to church, because those are pieces that people wrestle with when they step into unfamiliar territory and rooms like this, as welcoming as we are. You see, whatever and wherever it was, we all know that longing of wanting to belong. We likely have some point of reference for it of being on the outside looking in and longing to be on the inside and knowing that we belong. As sobering as some of these memories may be, maybe we can even recall a time when we might have been the one excluding somebody else, and you kind of reckoning with and wrestling with the emotions of being that person that maybe caused somebody else to feel disconnected. Knowing these realities, I want to fast forward to today, to right here, right now. In this moment, what does it look like for us to be making room for others? Again, one of the core values here at Discovery is this: community is our strength. And what I love about that value is how alive it is in this room, in this physical space, that it wasn't just something that launched this church just over 5 years ago, I believe, but it's something that's alive now, and it's not on a wall just posted somewhere or referenced somewhere, maybe in a sermon series throughout the year. This is happening, and it's so important. It's being invested in really cool ways. So I want to highlight something that I think you're going to hear a little bit more about, and you've obviously been in the throes of, this renovation that's happening all around us. When Pastor Lauren was telling me about this, it was so encouraging to my heart to hear that the physical space was matching the heartbeat, not just of this community, not just of this leadership and dream team, but of God's heart to make space, to literally make room for people in Sherwood Park and the greater Edmonton area. More room for kids ministry, unpacking right here, kitchen and tables. Tables, like if there's anything that we long for, it's food and drink with the people we love and the people that we can be fully known by and fully accepted by. Tables. Alpha, one of the best things that I've ever seen come to the church internationally is this program of being able to explore and ask questions and do so in the context of safe and loving community. And ultimately, it's making room for discovery. Right? I mean, a little too on the nose maybe, but that's literally what we're doing in and through this renovation process, in and through launching a church in the first place, is making room for people to discover their purpose that God put into them when they were being knit together in their mother's womb. That is the heartbeat, and I love seeing that unfold. So as your Discovery family grows in number and grows in relationship, we have to realize that making room is not always comfortable. Sometimes there's sound issues, right? Sometimes it's welcoming the other who may see things a little different than us politically, who may see things a little different than us and how we were raised in our particular worldview, who may be of a whole different faith altogether. Will we be the space where anybody is welcome to come and sit at the table and discover who Jesus is, right? Are we willing to get a little messy with this and a little uncomfortable? But hear me, how amazing, how Christ-centered our love is when it doesn't hinge on someone acting or looking the way we think they should. How amazing for any and all to walk through these doors and to be treated as if they were the lead pastor or part of the team that launched this place. Maybe their first time here, feeling that sense of honor and welcome and belonging. How awesome is love on display like that? I think this resonates so much because someone made room for me. Lauren referenced our teenage years, and I remember well, grade 10 in particular was very troublesome for my life. And I see it looking back now as a pivotal year. And I was just so angry at God through my teenage years for seemingly getting caught doing everything I did wrong. It was like dragged into the light somehow. Now I look back, I thank God for those moments of getting caught because maybe that's what helped turn me around. But either way, this particular regional youth weekend that we used to look forward to as an opportunity to connect with friends, girls, and and ultimately our youth leaders set this up to connect with God. And in the midst of this particular regional youth weekend, I made some horrible decisions that went against every policy and procedure and everything that they wanted. So I was supposed to be sent home. They called my parents and basically said, Matthew's on his way, figure out transportation. He needs to leave. And in the midst of all of that, and finding out that I was going to be sent home out of this context, I got pretty hard-hearted. And a youth leader who knew my brothers, who at the time weren't serving the Lord, has said, no, hold on a second. Before we just do what the book says to do, let me take Matthew for a little drive. And he had a sports car, which I thought was pretty awesome at the time. And he brought me through this incredible metropolis of Stephenville. And he started speaking truth into my life and just calling out what he saw that I couldn't see in that moment. Was he honest? Yes. Did the truth hurt? Yes. But there was a grace in his approach that I knew this guy wanted the best for my life. This guy knew my brothers, knew the trajectory they were on, and called me out as a potential light for my family, for my older brothers, and decided, hey, I don't care what it takes, you're not going home. Like, I believe God is into something in your life in a big way this weekend. And that night led to one of the most powerful encounters I've ever had with God, and my life has literally never been the same since. And I look back and say, man, if he didn't make room for me, if I left that weekend with only the feeling of punishment or being called out, if that was the only thing I took away from that weekend, I don't know if I would be where I am today. But somebody made room, and I thank God for his life, who's now a police officer in Ontario, and I reach out to him and remind him periodically of his impact. But that should be our posture. to take people as they are, to truly make room. Because when we have a good understanding of our own journey, of our own need for grace, it's a lot easier to display that kind of grace through us, right? When we are self-aware enough to know that outside of God's love and grace and mercy, I would not be able to stand with any sense of confidence today. When we have that sense, we are more likely to display it and to live it and for it to come through our words and our actions and us making room. Someone, again, did that for you, hopefully, and if not, I hope that this space becomes that for your life. Maybe this is the first time you have a sense of someone making room for your story. Well, again, it's not just about discovery, and this isn't a new tension. The tension that comes from making room has been around since the launch of the church in the first century. They kept grace and truth at the forefront, and they were forced into it, into this tension, into figuring this out in a really real way that I want to unpack for you today. According to Luke, who wrote the Gospel of Luke, but also Acts, he's a doctor historian, and according to him, he unpacks in Acts how the church launched, and it launched big. On opening day alone, thousands of Jews and converts to Judaism made decisions to follow Jesus. This happened in Jerusalem, but it wasn't contained just in this population. It started to spread outside of the city. And in short order, people flood outside of the city with the news of Jesus' death and resurrection. And even though this movement launched from Judaism and was primarily Jewish at this point, many Gentiles or non-Jewish people were believing, and many more leaning into to explore more and what could this look like for my story, and realizing this is for me too. Like, there was a sense of leaning in. But most Jewish believers weren't ready for this. Jesus was their Messiah. This was the one that their prophets, their scriptures pointed to. Jesus himself was Jewish, so they were having a hard time reckoning with this kind of opening the floodgates and making room for the Gentiles. It wasn't making sense to a lot of these early Jewish believers and leaders. And into that context, some of Jesus' original disciples intentionally went to the Gentiles with the good news that Jesus, though Jewish, paved the way for all people to be right with God. Many Gentiles believed and became devoted to following the ways and the teachings of Jesus. And here's where the tension came. Here's where the dilemma was. The Gentiles didn't see themselves as converts to Judaism. They saw themselves as converting and following the way of a whole new way. The man, the person, Jesus. And yet Jews, a lot of them, couldn't reckon with how could someone follow a Jewish Messiah and not become Jewish. It didn't make sense to them. They weren't just uneasy about it. Some of them were deeply offended that this was even being preached and made permissible. This overarching dilemma brought about some difficult tensions as they navigated life together in community in the early church. Gentiles left some of their pagan beliefs, but brought some of their own behaviors and customs. Some of these were sacrilege to the Jews, especially when it came to what they could eat, what they were permitted to eat, and their habits in general. This was messy. It was beautiful, but it was messy. And unfortunately, the reaction from some of the Jews was to give these newcomers, these outsiders, this list of rules and regulations that Pastor Lauren referenced in his talk earlier. In order to become insiders, here's what we expect you to do. Here's how you need to align with who we are as Jewish believers. 613 laws, not the least of which for the males to become circumcised. You can imagine the tension in the room. Acts chapter 15, we're going to dive into this and see how the leadership of the day navigated this for the church and some of the principles that flow right into our current day and what it means for us here at Discovery. Acts chapter 15, verse 2. Paul and Barnabas disagreed with them, arguing vehemently. Finally, the church decided to send Paul and Barnabas to Jerusalem, accompanied by some local believers, to talk to the apostles and elders about this question. So they were going to the main council that was kind of set in place, made up of largely apostles, people who walked with, served with Jesus while he was on earth. And they were kind of like the leadership of the day that had the last say. So they were sending Paul and Barnabas, who was saying, no, the gospel is for all. This is meant for Jews and Gentiles. They were sending them now to get some clarity to the council. The church sent the delegates to Jerusalem, and they stopped along the way in Phoenicia and Samaria to visit the believers there. They told them, much to everyone's joy, that the Gentiles too were being converted. Verse 4, when they arrived in Jerusalem, Barnabas and Paul were welcomed by the whole church, including the apostles and the elders. They reported everything that God had done through them. So again, this is just the setting up for this macro conversation decision. What are the council going to say when they hear what God is doing actually among the Gentiles? Verse 5, but some of the believers who belonged to the sect of the Pharisees stood up and insisted, these Gentile converts must be circumcised and required to follow the law of Moses, that's 613 laws and regulations. So these Pharisees, these leaders, there were some at that table that said, no. They can come, but there's some prerequisites here that had to be followed. Verse 6, so the apostles and elders met together to resolve this. At the meeting, after a long discussion, Peter stood and addressed them as follows. He says, brothers, you all know that God chose me from among you some time ago to preach to the Gentiles so that they could hear the good news and that they could believe. God knows people's hearts, he said, and he confirmed that he accepts Gentiles by giving them the Holy Spirit. He poured out his Spirit upon them at Cornelius' house in the same way that we received the Holy Spirit at the day of Pentecost. Like, there's incredible synergy here, brothers, he's saying. Continuing on, he made no distinction between us and them. He cleansed their hearts through faith. So why are you now challenging God by burdening the Gentile believers with a yoke that neither we nor our ancestors were able to bear? We believe that we are all saved by the same way, undeserved grace of the Lord Jesus Christ. So Peter just, the mic drop, right? Just, no. Here's the lay of the land. Here's what we need to come back to, this undeserved grace that has brought every single one of us into this community here today and back then when the church first launched. Verse 12, everyone listened quietly as Barnabas and Paul then told the miraculous signs and wonders that God had done through them amongst the Gentiles. And then all eyes are on James, the most influential member of the council, Jesus' brother. James was reluctant to believe even in his own journey at first after the resurrection, but was fully convinced of Jesus' identity as the Messiah once he's seen him post-death. But he wholeheartedly felt that non-Jewish believers should be allowed in without becoming Jewish. He quotes Amos. He points to the reality of the Gentiles being brought into the family as fulfilled prophecy. And then he says this, where I want us to land this text today. And so my judgment is that we should not make it difficult for the Gentiles who are turning to God. I love that. This, what Paul, Barnabas, Peter, and James were doing was making room, was making sure that we were clear that the whosoever from John 3:16 literally meant whoever comes in contact with us as believers, as a local church. But you and I know that it didn't always stay that way throughout history, whether through legalism, racism, sexism. People have been trying to separate and determine who gets in and who's out, who's seen, who's not seen, who's able to partake, who's not able to partake. It's happened and perpetuated. So this day in this room and in this family, what does it look like for us to make room moving forward? What if we made room for good news? Because it is good news. We can't lose sight of this fact. And we can diligently work to change methods. Our strategy could be different in 2022 than it was in 2017, than it will be in 2027. Like, probably needs to be, right? Our strategy, our methods can change, need to change, but wholeheartedly hold fast to that message of undeserved grace. When that's our anchor, we make room. Right? So what if we made room by holding fast to the gospel? I'm not talking truth without grace, and I'm not even talking grace without truth, because that's really not love or helpful to a lost and hurting world. I'm talking about grace and truth as it was unpacked through the ministry of Paul and Peter and Barnabas and the early church. And what if we made room also for gracious community? What if people could literally belong in this community, feel like family, even before they believed? That sense that I could be known for who I am and be fully loved. And that you, as a believer, could full on want that person to become a fully devoted follower of Jesus, but understand they're not there yet, and yet love them like family. What if we had room for gracious community like that, where people could belong, believe, and then become who God has created them to become, to discover their sense of purpose? For gracious community where you may encounter differing views on who you're going to vote for or what you might think about a particular issue that's happening or unfolding in society. Gracious community where you may not always see eye to eye on the finer points of theology, where you may encounter the curious, the skeptic, the sold out, the passionate, the wanderer, the one who used to believe but now doesn't understand. Or what if a gracious community where all could belong could exist right here in Sherwood Park? Can we find comfort in the tension of grace and truth? Our willingness to do so makes room for everyone at the table. And I love that this is heading into Alpha season, because that is literally at the table making room for those who are curious, skeptical, maybe burned out on religion. Recently, I watched a video on Discovery's YouTube channel. If you haven't seen it, I encourage you to go there this afternoon and watch the story of Grant, who's helping me have audio today. And I watched this, again, just trying to get a heart for the house and just to see what God is doing at Discovery. And it was Grant telling his story of hitting rock bottom in a season of his life, and in that time, getting an invite, maybe multiple invites, to be in this room. And I hear how Grant, sharing his heart, embraced, or was a community here. And for a full year, helped set up and tear down on Sundays when you were in a school gymnasium in your previous location, where he was welcomed and treated like family, like he belonged, even before he believed. And it was into that context of loving community where he got close enough to hear the good news over his life in a really dark season, where he actually realized that there is hope, that it is tangible, that I feel it even in community before I believed it and received it for myself. And he unpacks how about a year later, it was the timing was right. The lights came on, and he connected what he was feeling and receiving in community to the good news of Jesus and said, no, this is for me. This is what I want. I receive your grace. And stepped into a new beginning and a new life because somebody made room through invitation, but also after those feet stepped in through the doors in your previous location. See, incredibly, as Discovery made room for Grant, he made room in his heart for God's love and rescue. It's like the spiritual turning point. That may not always be the result. We may not always get to see that turning point happen, but we won't know unless we make room. We won't know the power of community, of someone being fully known and fully loved unless we make room. Every Christmas we sing, "Let every heart prepare him room." It is my favorite Christmas carol and lyric. And if this happens, and the more it happens, the more we will in turn make room for others. If I make room in my heart and my life for God, my life will make room for the other. That's just the natural overflow. The more I am in tune with the Spirit of God, the more the fruit of the Spirit is on and growing and being produced in and through my life, the more my life will make room for others. Around my table, in my driveway, at my workspace, whatever. Without compromise, we, like the council and the apostles in Acts 15, decided to not make it unnecessarily difficult for those who are turning to God. Before I pass it back to Pastor Lauren this morning, I want to share this quote from Andy Stanley. Andy Stanley actually wrote this book called Deep and Wide. If you haven't read it, especially as a leader, as a part of the team, it's just one of the most influential resources that I've tapped into to help me see through this lens of making room and not compromising at the same time. And he says this: be a people in process, a place where the curious, the unconvinced, the skeptical, the used to believe, and the broken, as well as the committed, the informed, the sold out, come together around Peter's declaration that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God. Both can happen. Both can be in the same room. Both can be at the same table. And I think that's when we're at our best, when both are in the room and at the same table. Before Pastor Lauren comes, maybe we could just pause for a moment. And I don't want to miss the opportunity that maybe, not knowing, again, who you are and the stories in the room, I don't want to assume that you've made room in your life for God. So if you're here and you are curious, you are searching to belong and to know that you are fully known and fully loved, and you've never made a decision to follow Jesus, and you would consider yourself feeling a little bit on the outside today. But in this moment, you're saying, I would love to receive that undeserved grace. I would love to start new. I would love a new beginning in this moment right here, right now. If that's you, I'm going to invite you to just bow with me for a moment. Just quietly, in your heart of hearts, pray this prayer with me. Dear Jesus, I acknowledge my need for you. I long to belong. I long to know that the creator of all, the creator of my life, looks and sees me full on, loves me full on, and has a plan for my life. I receive your grace and mercy today. And I choose to follow you. In Jesus' name, amen. Amen. If that's your heart, your prayer, and you've made a decision today, I encourage you to touch base with one of the volunteers that you'll see in your coming and going. God's not finished. He's not finished with your life. He's not finished with discovery. And I love, again, what your pastor's about to share today about what's next, what could be when we make room. God bless you today.